You really expect me to spend another Christmas explaining your lack of ambition to my family? She asked during a holiday dinner while her relatives sat quietly around the table. I smiled, finished my meal, and left early. 10 months later, her uncle called me personally to ask if the rumors about my new company were true. You really expect me to spend another Christmas explaining your lack of ambition to my family? She said it like she was commenting on the weather. Fork in hand, wine glass half empty, voice completely level. The table went silent. Not the polite kind of silence. Not the kind where someone clears their throat and reaches for the breadbasket. This was the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums. The kind that makes you suddenly aware of the hum of the refrigerator in the next room. 8 people sat around that table. Not one of them looked at me. Her mother studied her wine glass like it contained the answers to questions she hadn't asked yet. Her father found something deeply interesting in the grain of the tablecloth. Her cousin Adelaide looked down at her plate. Beatrice, her older sister, shifted slightly in her chair. Just slightly. Like the seat had become 2 degrees less comfortable. I looked at Penelope. She was still eating. That detail stuck with me more than anything else she said that night. She dropped those words into the middle of a holiday dinner and gone right back to cutting her roast like it was the most natural thing in the world. Like she hadn't just announced, in front of her entire assembled family, that I was something she'd been managing, containing, apologizing for. I didn't say anything immediately. I took a slow breath. I picked up my fork. And I noticed something strange. One person at the table hadn't reacted at all. Not with discomfort. Not with the polite horror everyone else was performing. Her Uncle Garrett sat completely still, watching me with an expression I couldn't read. Not cruel. Not sympathetic. Just watching. I told myself it meant nothing. I finished my meal. I folded my napkin, placed it beside my plate, wished everyone a quiet Merry Christmas, and left 40 minutes before dessert. Nobody stopped me. Nobody called after me. Nobody texted that night. I drove home through December streets that were lit up with lights I didn't feel, and I told myself I was fine, that it was just a bad moment. That couples had worse. That it would pass. I didn't realize it then, but that dinner would end up costing her far more than our relationship. If you enjoy real stories like this, subscribe, because what happened next changed everything for me. I was 31 years old. Penelope and I had been together for 3 years and 4 months. I remember the exact number because at the time, I'd been carrying a small velvet box in the back of my desk drawer for 6 weeks. Not because I was stalling, because I was waiting for the right moment. That's the detail that made that Christmas dinner land differently than she intended. She didn't know about the box. Nobody did. We'd met at a rooftop event in the summer. Mutual friends, easy conversation, the kind of connection that feels effortless in the beginning because neither person is showing their full hand yet. She was sharp, organized, funny in a dry way I genuinely admired. She worked in marketing at a mid-sized agency in Midtown. She had opinions. She had taste. She made every room feel more put together just by being in it. I'd fallen for her completely. By month 6, we were splitting time between her apartment in the West Village and mine in Hoboken. By year 2, we were talking about the future the way couples do when they believe they're on the same page, casually, almost lazily, the way you talk about things you expect to simply happen. Her family had money, old money, the quiet kind, spread across real estate holdings in Connecticut and a family business her father had built over 30 years. They weren't flashy about it, but you felt it in the way they spoke, the way they moved through rooms, the expectations they carried without ever stating them directly. I was building something. That's the cleanest way to describe where I was professionally at that point. I'd left a stable consulting job 18 months earlier to develop a software product for mid-market supply chain operations. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the kind of thing you explained at a dinner table and watched eyes light up. But it was real, it was growing, and I believed in it with the kind of quiet certainty that doesn't need applause. Penelope knew about it. Or she knew the version of it I could explain in 5 minutes. Whether she'd ever actually listened, that I didn't understand yet. What I stood to lose that Christmas was not abstract. It was 3 years of shared history. A future I'd been building in my mind. A relationship I'd reorganized my entire emotional life around. The ring was still in my desk drawer. And as I drove home that night through the dark, the strange thing wasn't the anger. The anger was manageable. The strange thing was that I couldn't stop thinking about Garrett. The uncle who hadn't reacted. Just watched. Why? In hindsight, the dinner wasn't the beginning. It was just the first time she forgot to keep her voice down. The first real incident I should have clocked happened about 14 months into the relationship. We were at her family's place in Connecticut for a long weekend. A beautiful old colonial with a wraparound porch and the kind of casual luxury that looks like it wasn't trying. Her sister Beatrice's boyfriend at the time, a finance guy named Holden, had just gotten a promotion. Corner office. Managing director title. The kind of announcement that makes an entire family dinner louder and brighter without anyone acknowledging why. After dinner, when we were washing dishes together, Penelope said it so casually I almost didn't register it. Holden's doing really well for himself. He seems great, I said. His family doesn't have to worry about anything, you know? Like, there's no question. She paused. I think that's what I want eventually. That's certainty. I thought she meant financial security in the general sense. I didn't understand she was drawing a comparison. There were others. Her friend Adelaide, technically her college roommate, practically a third sister, had a habit of asking questions that weren't really questions. So are you still doing the startup thing? The word's still doing a lot of heavy lifting there. Or, my cousin tried to start a company once. It was really hard on his wife. The uncertainty of it, you know? I smiled through all of it. I was good at that. Beatrice was subtler but more pointed. She had a way of describing successful men, their cars, their apartments, their titles, that always seemed to happen when I was in the room. Not directed at me. Just present. Like a frequency only certain people could hear. About 8 months before that Christmas dinner, my friend Holden, not Penelope's sister's boyfriend, a different Holden, my closest friend since college, told me something I didn't want to hear. We were having drinks at a bar in Tribeca after work. I don't want to overstep, he said. I already knew what was coming. But I've been around Penelope a few times now, and the way she talks about what you're doing, or the way she doesn't talk about it, it's not what I'd expect from someone who's in your corner. I told him he was misreading her. I told him she was private about business stuff, that she didn't want to jinx things by talking about them, that she was just careful. Holden nodded slowly. He let it go. But there was a moment, I can pinpoint it now with uncomfortable clarity, about 5 months before the Christmas dinner, when Penelope said something that I filed away at the time as a joke. We were watching a documentary about a tech founder's rise and fall, one of those stories with a cautionary arc. And at the part where the founder loses everything, Penelope laughed a little and said, "See, this is why I could never date someone who was just hoping something would work out." She was looking at the screen, not at me, but she knew I was there. I laughed too, because that felt easier than asking what she meant. It didn't feel like a joke anymore after Christmas. The dinner had started quietly enough. Her parents' house in Westchester. 14 people around a table that seated 12 comfortably, so the 2 end chairs were slightly crooked, and someone always had to turn sideways to pass the dishes. Christmas music playing from somewhere in the back of the house. A fire going. The whole picture-perfect performance of a family that had done this 100 times. I'd brought wine. Good wine. I'd looked it up. Her father, Sterling, not my business partner, her father's name, accepted it with a nod that suggested appreciation wasn't going to be verbal. He was the kind of man who communicated in gradations of mild approval. If he didn't find fault, that was his version of warmth. The early part of the evening was fine. Then her cousin Marcus started talking about his year. Marcus was 34, worked at a private equity firm, had recently closed something significant enough that the number got mentioned 3 times in 90 minutes. Each time it came up, Sterling Sr. nodded slowly, the way men nod when they're confirming their own worldview. "That's what this family does," Sterling said at one point. "We build things that last." I noticed Penelope glance at me. Not subtly. The questions started around the main course. "So how's the business going?" Her Aunt Margot asked it pleasantly, but Margot had a gift for making pleasant questions feel like depositions. "What's the valuation at right now?" I explained, calmly, that we weren't at a valuation stage, that we were focused on product market fit, that early stage development wasn't really a number conversation yet. Margot nodded. "So it's still very early." "Building takes time," I said. "Of course it does." She smiled. "Sterling, didn't your father say the same thing about the hardware store before it went under?" A beat of laughter. I smiled. Garrett, her uncle, hadn't said a word. He sat with his wine glass in his hand, watching the table with that same unreadable expression I'd caught earlier. Not uncomfortable, not amused, just present, like a man who was cataloging something. I took a breath. I finished my food. I folded my napkin, and I left. She texted at 11:47 p.m. that night. "You didn't have to make it weird by leaving." I read it, set my phone face down, stared at the ceiling for a while. In the morning, I called her. We had the conversation that couples have when one person has said something that can't be unsaid. The kind of conversation that starts with, "I need to talk about last night," and ends somewhere neither person planned to be. Penelope's position was that she'd been frustrated, that she'd said it badly, that the pressure of her family's expectations sometimes came out sideways, that I was being oversensitive. I told her the word another was the part one couldn't move past. She paused. "What do you mean?" "You said another Christmas," I said, "which means you've been explaining me to them before. In private. As a problem." A long silence. "I've just had to manage expectations," she said finally. "My family has a certain way of thinking about men like me. About stability," she said. "About trajectory." We went in circles for not dramatically. I didn't move cities or delete my accounts. I just contracted. I stopped going to the events where I might run into people from that world. I let certain friendships cool naturally. I went quiet on social media, not in the wounded way, but in the focused way, the way you go quiet when you're building something that requires all available noise to stop. The first 3 months after the breakup, I worked 12 hours a day. My closest friend, the other Holden, my Holden, called me every Sunday. Not to check if I was okay. He knew I was okay. He called because he wanted updates. Because he'd been watching what I was building longer than anyone, and he believed in it with a loyalty that had nothing to do with sentimentality. "Show me the numbers," he'd say, and I'd show him. They weren't impressive yet, but they were moving in the right direction. About 2 months after the breakup, I had a conversation with a man named Weston. Weston was 43, a former operations executive who'd built and sold 2 mid-market companies before most people his age had even figured out what they wanted to do. He'd reached out through a LinkedIn connection, one of those messages that usually end up being a waste of time. But there was something in the way he'd framed his note. Specific. Informed. Like he'd actually read what I was doing rather than scanning the headline. We met for coffee in the Flatiron District on a Tuesday morning. He ordered black coffee. Didn't look at his phone once for the entire hour and a half we talked. "Your unit economics are better than you think," he said at one point. "You're underselling the problem you're solving because you're too close to it." That one sentence changed how I pitched the company. Then there was Sterling. Not Penelope's father. A different Sterling, Sterling Vance, who ran a boutique venture fund out of a small office in Chelsea and had a reputation for betting on founders before the market agreed with him. Weston introduced us in February, 7 weeks after the breakup. Sterling listened to my pitch for 12 minutes without interrupting. Then he said, "What does your cap table look like?" Which meant he was interested. The first check wasn't large, but it was real, and it came with something more valuable than money: credibility. The kind that opens the next door and the door after that. I worked. I learned. I failed in small ways and recovered in smaller ways that built on each other. Then, in April, everything nearly collapsed. A key integration partner we'd built our entire Q2 roadmap around pulled out of the agreement. Not maliciously. They'd been acquired, priorities shifted, our contract fell into a gray area. I got the call on a Thursday afternoon sitting in my apartment with a cup of coffee that went cold while I absorbed what was happening. I called Weston. He didn't panic. "Okay," he said. "Who are the next 3? "I don't have a next 3. "Then we build a next 3. Tonight." We worked until 2 in the morning. By the following Monday, I had 2 alternatives in conversation. By the end of April, one had signed. It was better than the original. But I almost quit that Thursday. I sat in my apartment with the cold coffee and the collapsing roadmap, and for about 45 minutes I understood, in a cellular way, exactly what Penelope had been afraid of. Not because she was right, but because the fear was real. Building something is genuinely terrifying. The ground shifts. The map becomes wrong. You are alone with outcomes that depend on choices you won't be sure were correct until they either are or they aren't. I didn't quit. I kept going. And somewhere in that stretch, somewhere between the cold coffee and the new partnership agreement, a clarity settled in me that I hadn't expected. There was still one thing I didn't understand about that Christmas dinner. Garrett, the uncle who watched without reacting. What had he decided? It came from an unexpected source. Marcus, Penelope's cousin, the real estate guy, the one who'd texted me privately after the breakup, and I had stayed loosely in touch. Not close, but occasionally a text, occasionally a shared article about the market. The kind of peripheral contact that men maintain without explaining why. In May, we got drinks in the city. He ordered a beer and looked at me for a moment before speaking. "I probably shouldn't tell you this," he said. "Then don't," I said. "But I'd rather you did." He nodded once. "You know the family has money," he said. I nodded. What you probably don't know is that a big part of that money is in Garrett's hands. Not legally, not officially, but practically. Garrett manages the family's investment decisions. Has for about 15 years. Sterling Sr. built the business. Garrett grew it. I waited. Garrett is very quiet about what he thinks. He doesn't pronounce on people. But when he forms an opinion, the family follows it, whether they admit it or not. Marcus turned his glass slowly. About a year before that Christmas dinner, maybe 14 months, Garrett asked Penelope what your business model was. She apparently couldn't explain it. She'd never really asked. I said, right. He paused. So Garrett did his own research. Looked at what you were building from the outside. And apparently, this is the part that gets me. He thought it was actually interesting. Thought you had something real. I sat with that. He told her father. Marcus continued. That's the conversation referenced in whatever email you found. He told Sterling Sr. that the kid Penelope was dating might be worth paying attention to. That he had the right instincts for the problem he was trying to solve. And Sterling Sr. told Penelope. And Penelope interpreted it as Garrett being polite. Marcus shook his head. She told Beatrice that Garrett was just being charitable because he didn't want family drama. She didn't take it seriously. I looked out the window at the street. So the family's most qualified person to evaluate what I was building, I said slowly, had already evaluated it. And decided it was real. And nobody told me. Nobody told you because Penelope decided the opinion didn't count. That reframed everything. Every dismissive comment at that dinner table. Every side eye from Margot. Every still doing the startup thing from Adelaide. These people had been operating on Penelope's characterization of me, which was built on her fear, which had overridden the only genuinely informed perspective in the room. And Garrett sat at that Christmas dinner and watched me leave. He already knew something the rest of the table didn't. He knew the dinner was a mistake. He just didn't intervene. I understood that, sitting across from Marcus in that bar in May. Some people watch. They let the story unfold. They wait for the evidence to accumulate before they speak. Garrett was one of those people. I just didn't know yet what he intended to say. By August, the company had crossed a threshold that changed how people talked about it. We'd landed 2 enterprise clients, the kind with actual procurement processes, actual contracts, actual renewals built into the structure. Weston had helped us restructure the pricing model, which turned a product that had been interesting on paper into one that made obvious financial sense to the people signing the checks. Sterling Vance's fund increased their position. A write-up appeared in a trade publication that covered supply chain technology, not a flashy outlet, but the right one, read by exactly the people who mattered for what we were doing. The calls started coming in. Holden texted me the morning the article dropped. Told you. I told you. He had. Repeatedly. For years. With the kind of quiet conviction that's easy to dismiss until suddenly it isn't. Old acquaintances resurfaced. People I'd lost touch with during the contraction period. Some were genuine. Some were transactional. I'd gotten better at distinguishing between the two. Then Marcus texted me in mid-August. You're coming up in conversations you might not expect. I asked what he meant. Family conversations. I let that sit. Around the same time, I heard through the loose network of mutual people that things hadn't gone the way Penelope expected after the breakup. I hadn't asked. I wasn't tracking it. But information finds its way. She'd started dating someone new. A man who checked the boxes she'd apparently been building in her mind. Stable job, recognizable company, a title that parsed well at family dinners. They'd moved quickly, posted consistently. The whole public performance of a relationship that was working. Except that, by August, the relationship was apparently over. I didn't know the details. I didn't pursue them. But the fact of it arrived, and I registered it without satisfaction, which surprised me slightly. I'd expected to feel something sharper. Instead, there was just a kind of quiet understanding. People who are running from uncertainty don't find peace in certainty. They just find a different kind of restless. What I kept coming back to was the question Marcus had raised. Why was her uncle suddenly interested? He'd had an opinion about me for over a year. He hadn't acted on it. The dinner had happened. The breakup had happened. 10 months had passed. What had changed? I didn't have to wait long for the answer. By September, I'd convinced myself the Penelope chapter was fully closed. The business was growing. The team had expanded. Weston had taken an advisory seat, which brought credibility and connections in equal measure. I'd moved into a new apartment, not ostentatiously, but noticeably better, with a view that felt like a small private acknowledgement of the distance traveled. I was sleeping well. I was working with intention. I felt, for the first time and longer than I could pinpoint, genuinely settled. Then a message arrived through an unexpected channel. Not to me directly. Holden forwarded it. A screenshot, no explanation attached at first, just the image. A post from a semi-private account I didn't follow, shared in a group of people adjacent to both Penelope's world and mine. In it, Penelope had written something that reframed the last 10 months. The post described the end of our relationship, not by name, carefully vague, but constructed in a way that anyone who knew us would recognize immediately. In her version, she had left a relationship with someone whose instability had been a drain on her well-being. She described years of emotional uncertainty and carrying the weight of someone else's unfinished dreams. It was published the same week the trade article about my company had been shared widely. The timing was not accidental. Holden called 5 minutes after he sent the screenshot. She saw the article, he said. I know. And she's trying to get ahead of the story. I understood immediately what was happening. The success was becoming visible. And visible success has a way of retroactively embarrassing the people who dismissed it. Penelope was managing that embarrassment the only way she knew how, by rewriting the sequence. In her version, she'd made the right call. She'd left someone unstable. The fact that he'd gone on to build something real was incidental, maybe even suspicious. I didn't respond publicly. I didn't address it at all. But something about it lodged in my chest in a way that the breakup itself hadn't. Because the breakup had been honest, in its brutal way. This wasn't honest. This was something else. And then, 3 days later, my phone rang. Unknown number. Connecticut area code. I almost didn't answer. I picked up on the 4th ring. Is this? And he used my name. My full name. Careful and deliberate. It is, I said. This is Garrett. Penelope's uncle. A beat of silence. I know who you are, I said. I imagine you do. His voice was what I remembered, measured, unhurried, a slight formality to the cadence that wasn't unfriendly. I won't take up much of your time. I've been following the press around your company. I wanted to ask directly, are the numbers in that trade piece accurate, or are they being conservative? I paused. Of all the ways I'd imagined this conversation beginning, and I'd imagined several, this wasn't one of them. They're accurate, I said. If anything, slightly conservative. We had a strong month after that went to print. Thought so. A quiet pause. You've built something real. I have. I told my niece that 2 years ago, and there it was. I sat down. Marcus told me. I said. I figured he might, eventually. Garrett's tone didn't shift. I want to be transparent with you about why I'm calling. Partly professional interest. I look at investments in this space, and what you're doing is relevant to things I've been watching. But there's another part. I waited. That dinner, he said. I've thought about it a great deal. So have I. I should have intervened. His voice was level, but there was something underneath it. Not guilt exactly. Something more like the acknowledgement of an error made by a careful man who doesn't make many. I had a choice in that moment. I chose to watch. I've reconsidered that choice. Why didn't you? I asked. A long pause. Because I thought she would figure it out herself, he said. I gave her the assessment. I told my brother what I thought. I assumed that information would reach her in a useful form and she'd act on it. A brief silence. I underestimated how much the family dynamic distorted everything. And I underestimated how committed she was to a version of you she'd already decided on. I processed that. Her mother and aunt were the loudest voices, he continued. They've always equated status with security. It's a particular kind of thinking that looks like wisdom until it isn't. He paused. Margot especially. She's been filtering people for 40 years based on titles and addresses. She was never going to evaluate what you were building. She was going to evaluate whether it looked finished yet. And it didn't look finished. No, it didn't. Another pause. Penelope wanted approval from those voices. And somewhere along the way, she adopted their framework without realizing she had. I looked out the window. The city below was doing what the city always does. Indifferent, continuous, enormous. What do you want from this conversation, Garrett? I asked. He almost laughed. Honestly, I wanted to hear your voice. Make sure you were who I thought you were. A beat. You are. And I wanted to tell you, on behalf of myself, at minimum, that the dinner was wrong. Not just poorly handled. Wrong. We talked for another 20 minutes. Business, mostly. Garrett had specific questions, the kind that only get asked by someone who understands what they're looking at. He wasn't fishing. He was confirming. The structure of his inquiry told me he'd already done significant independent research and was now pressure testing conclusions. Before we hung up, he said something I didn't expect. Penelope's post, he said. The one this week. I saw it. The family saw it too. A quiet pause. It didn't play the way she thought it would. I didn't ask him to elaborate. But he continued. Beatrice called me after she read it. She said it made her uncomfortable. That it seemed, and this is her word, desperate. He paused. My sister-in-law, Penelope's mother, said nothing publicly. But she called her daughter the following morning, and the call lasted 4 minutes. For minutes. I understood what that meant. Penelope had spent years managing how her family saw the men she dated. She'd positioned herself as the one with the sound judgment, the standard bearer, the daughter who knew what the family was worth and behaved accordingly. The post hadn't read as confident. It had read as reactive, and the people whose approval she'd been chasing her entire adult life had noticed. I sat with that for a long moment. What Penelope had lost wasn't the relationship. People lose relationships. They recover. They rebuild. She would too, in time. What she'd lost was the credibility of the narrative she'd built the relationships ending on. She'd told the family, and herself, that she'd made a clear-eyed, values-aligned decision. That the man she'd left was a pleasant mistake, corrected efficiently. And then the trade press published a story about his company. And she panicked. And the panic told everyone more than the original decision ever had. Garrett said, before hanging up, I'll be in touch about the investment conversation. Professionally, I think there's something to discuss. I'd be glad to have it, I said. And then, after a brief pause, thank you for calling. I should have spoken up sooner, he said simply. We hung up. I set the phone down on the table. Through the window, the city moved in its usual unfeeling way. The lights were doing what December lights do in New York, something between beautiful and indifferent, the kind of view that asks nothing of you. I thought about the ring that was no longer in my desk drawer. I'd returned it 6 months ago. I thought about the dinner table and Garrett's expression and the word another and the cold coffee and the partnership that almost collapsed and Weston's voice on the phone at 2 a.m. and Sterling Vance's hand extending across a table. I thought about everything I hadn't understood at the beginning. And then I let it go. Here is where everyone ended up. Weston joined the company formally in October. His operational experience solved 3 problems we'd been circling for months. He was blunt, efficient, and constitutionally incapable of letting bad decisions survive a meeting. Sterling Vance's fund led our Series A. Holden, my Holden, flew in from Chicago when the round closed. We had dinner at a place in the West Village neither of us could have afforded 3 years ago. He didn't make a speech about being right. He just ordered a good bottle of wine and said, okay, what's next? That's the kind of person worth keeping. Garrett and I had 2 professional conversations over the following months. He invested a personal amount, not the family fund, something separate and deliberate. He never explained the distinction directly. He didn't need to. Adelaide texted me once around the holidays. Heard things are going well. Happy for you. I thanked her and wished her a good new year. Clean and simple. Penelope, from what I understand, is doing fine. She's working. She's living her life. She's building the version of the future she wants. I mean that without irony. She's not a villain in this story. She's a person who made choices inside a framework she'd inherited, and the framework turned out to be wrong. And that's a genuinely hard thing to discover about yourself. I hope she figures it out. I think she will. Marcus and I still get drinks occasionally. He never says I told you so. Neither do I. That Christmas dinner was the last time she ever had to explain me to anyone. After that, my work did it for her.